You tell what we did, Agnes.
In 1974, one of the most influential and underrated horror films of all time would make its theatrical debut, a little holiday horror classic called Black Christmas. Director Bob Clark had worked on several films prior to Black Christmas, some low-budget horror fare like Death Dream and Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, a sort of humorous homage to George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. It was hard getting director's work unless you were doing a horror film or adult films, but Bob really didn't want to do adult films, so horror it was. In 1972, he emigrated to Canada, where he began to work on a film called Stop Me, a film written by writer Roy Moore. The script played on the old urban legend of a babysitter being called by a stranger, asking her if she's checked on the children lately, until eventually she phones the police, who tell her the calls are coming from inside the home. The script drew inspiration from several real-life events. First, in November 1943 in Westmount, Montreal, a 14-year-old boy named George Webster brutally attacked his mother with a baseball bat, bludgeoning the woman to death in the process. He would also attack his other family members, but they would all survive his barbaric attack. Because no reason for the attack could be found, the boy was sent to a mental hospital, which directly reflects the killer in Black Christmas. The second real-life inspiration came in the form of a serial killer named William Herons, also known as the Lipstick Killer. He killed 3 women between 1945 and 1946, and at one of the crime scenes he wrote "Stop Me" with lipstick, which would lead to him gaining the moniker of the Lipstick Killer, and the reason why the original script was called Stop Me. When Bob began working on the film, he rewrote roughly half of it. First, he removed the babysitter and children from the film. Bob Clark felt it was far too violent of a premise to have children involved, so the easiest way to skirt around this was by changing it from a babysitter to a sorority house. Second, he also added in a bit more humor and levity. The original script was a bit drier and even had a darker tone to it, so Bob added some vulgarity to Margot Kidder's character and based the den mother off his own aunt, who would hide bottles of booze all over the house. Bob was not really a fan of traditional horror films. He didn't think the characters, especially the teenagers, were really all that realistic or well written. One of the biggest gripes was the portrayal of women. He set a strict rule for himself that at no point in the film would the women be objectified or appear nude. He wanted each and every girl to feel like a real unique college-aged girl and not some cheap piece of meat waiting to take her top off and die. Writer Roy Moore never wanted to keep the killer hidden throughout the entirety of the film. He wanted the audience to at some point see who the killer was. However, with some convincing from Bob, he eventually went along with it. The budget for the film was $686,000 Canadian dollars. Bob Clark would come in every morning with a Rolodex of cards that would have each and every shot he wanted to complete for the day. Once he sees the set and what he'll be working with, he maps out every shot on note cards, the camera position, where the actors will be standing, lighting, everything. Because of the low budget, he had to save as much time and money as he could, which is why he would always come so prepared. Bob's belief is no matter how good or bad a script is, it all comes down to your actors. You can have the best script in the world, but with bad actors, you're gonna get a bad film. And the opposite is also true. You can have a bad script with great actors, and you can still have a great film. Given their budget, they wanted to get the best talent they possibly could. Bob's first choice for Jess Bradford was always Olivia Hussey after her performance in Romeo and Juliet. She agreed and signed on saying she needed the money, but she also told co-producer Jerry Arbade that she had seen a psychic prior to landing the role who told her she would work on a film in Canada that would make a lot of money and would be a great success. Bob really wanted Keir Dullea for the role of Peter, but did not think he would be able to get him. He was just coming off Stanley Kubrick's 2001 and most likely wouldn't want to star in a small Canadian horror film. He was wrong, however, when Keir signed on, especially after finding out Olivia Hussey was involved because he really wanted to work with her, and well, who can blame him? Margot Kidder had just come out with the film Sisters, and Clark knew she was what he was looking for Barb. She wasn't quite Lois Lane as of yet, but you could see she had something special. Margot was drawn to the role because it wasn't a typical good girl. She could push boundaries and didn't have to play safe. Gilda Radner was originally cast as Phyllis or Phil, but would land a role on Saturday Night Live the month before the movie was set to start filming, which forced her to pull out. Instead, they cast future SCTV icon Andrea Martin. Art Hindle was cast in the role of Chris Hayden. It was the biggest role he had gotten up to that point in his career. Because his part was smaller, Bob also had him read for the part of Peter, played by Keir Dullea. After he finished, Bob became fidgety in his seat and told Art that he wishes he would have given him that part instead. Bob knew he wanted Doug McGrath for the role of Sergeant Nash, the dim-witted police officer who ends up being the butt of the joke more times than not. He was hired without even having to give an audition. Bob didn't know it at the time, but Doug was really happy to get the job. Den Mother Mrs. Mac was based on Clark's own Aunt Mabel, who would hide bottles of booze all over the house. Bette Davis was originally asked to play the Den Mother, but turned the role down. Instead, Marion Waldman would take up the role. She was mostly a writer and stage performer, so this was quite the change for her, but she would go on to be one of the most memorable parts of the film. Bob originally wanted Edmund O'Brien for the role of Lieutenant Ken Fuller. Producer Jerry Arbade negotiated with O'Brien, and they struck a deal. O'Brien arrived 2 days prior to shooting so he could be fitted for wardrobe and other preparations. However, when Bob and Jerry saw him, he was in a wheelchair. O'Brien would struggle with basic things like just putting on his coat. It wasn't until the men went out for dinner that O'Brien would tell the men he wanted to go upstairs to his room, not realizing he was at a restaurant. This is when they found out he was suffering with the beginnings of Alzheimer. They realized then and there that there was no way he'd be able to play the part of the lieutenant, searching for a missing girl in the frigid Canadian winter. Jerry had the unfortunate task of informing Edmund O'Brien that he wouldn't be able to play the role despite him insisting that he was fit enough to do so. Edmund broke down and cried, and it was an overall awful experience for everyone involved. If it weren't for actor John Saxon signing on at the last moment, it's quite possible the entire shoot could have been cancelled. John Saxon was given a script to read early on, and he thought it would be a successful film. He agreed to do it, only to get a call days later that a mistake had been made and the role had already been filled. A few more days had passed by, and John got an urgent call from his agents asking if he could be on a plane to Toronto that day as he was desperately needed. When John arrived in Toronto only a mere 2 hours later, he was fitted in wardrobe and was right on set ready to start filming. John's first day of the shoot was during the scene in the park around 1 or 2 in the morning in the blistering cold of the Canadian winter. The actors weren't the only part that were important to the film. Another very important aspect was the house itself. The house was found on a Toronto side street after a very extensive and tiring search. When Bob found it, he went up and asked if he could look around. Luckily for him, the people that owned it didn't mind and even found it to be amusing. But he knew this was the house. Not only did its design fit what they had in the script, it also had this unmistakable character that was essential to the film. The layout of the house has this claustrophobic atmosphere to it that just makes it feel like you're being watched at all times. The house would become another iconic addition to the film and reminiscent of other horror houses like the Elm Street house, the Psycho house, and the Amityville horror house. Filming commenced on Black Christmas in Toronto, Ontario, Canada from March 25th to May 11th, 1974. The film tells the story of sorority girls as they are stalked and killed by a deranged madman during the Christmas season. From the very beginning of the film, audiences are treated to a point of view shot from the killer Billy, something that would become a mainstay in horror cinema. Although films like the Michael Powell directed Peeping Tom would use the technique more than a decade prior, it can be argued that Black Christmas, along with John Carpenter's Halloween, are what perfected it. Camera operator Burt Dunk created a body brace for the camera, which would allow him to place the camera right on his shoulder and give him more freedom of movement. It also had a pad running down the front that he could lift up, which in turn would make the camera tilt up as well. This was crucial in allowing him to climb up the trellis in the beginning of the film, but once he did, they knew they had the right setup. The entire reason for the POV shots were twofold. One, they were working with a small budget and it would be too costly to film another actor. And two, because Bob didn't want the audience to ever see who the killer was. You get glimpses here and there, a shadow, an eye, but you never see who the person really is. While the girls all enjoy the Christmas festivities, the killer in the film, Billy, makes his way to the attic where he will spend the majority of the film. He will come out from time to time to watch the girls, unaware of the danger that they are in. This is when the girls get their first call from the man they call the Moaner. Beyond the brief glimpses of violence in the film, the most disturbing parts are the chilling phone calls the girls receive. A deranged man can be heard shouting and screaming, saying some of the most vile and reprehensible things imaginable, even by today's standards. The most shocking thing is despite how nasty the phone calls were, they never seemed to create any kind of controversy. The producers were never asked to tone it down or cut any of it out. People even still to this day are shocked that something so vile actually came out in 1974. The real terrifying part of the phone calls is it sounds like multiple people, men and women. You can hear what sounds like parents scolding a young boy named Billy for harming his sister Agnes, and it's really disturbing. Nick Mancuso performed the main voice for Billy, or the Stalker, but much of the yelling and screaming is director Bob Clark himself. Nick auditioned for the role by sitting in a chair with his back facing Bob, so he couldn't see Nick's face when he read his lines. An actress by the name of Anne Sweeney would also provide voices for the phone calls, along with the camera operator Burt Dunk. Nick apparently stood on his head while doing his lines because according to him, it would help compress his thorax, which helped give it a weird sound. Carl Zittrell was the man responsible for mixing the dreaded phone calls made to the sorority, and unlike today, it was quite the challenge to get the right sound. You couldn't just add a phone effect to it and call it a day. It was an entire process that took a lot of work, but paid off with one of the most chilling sounds ever put in a horror movie.
I'll stick my tongue up your pretty pussy.
You f***ing creep!
I'm going to kill you.
Along with mixing the chilling phone calls, Carl Zittrell also composed the music for the film. The score for the movie would end up being very understated. It wasn't loud and bombastic like modern day horror. Most of the time it was very subdued, with only the chilling ambiance of a cold winter's night or the sounds of carolers as they sing traditional Christmas songs. The music never takes over the scene or dominates it, but just a few keys from a piano is all that is really needed to enhance the dread that the characters are about to experience. After the disturbing call, Claire Harris begins to pack her bags to spend the Christmas break with her parents. All the while, the killer stalks her from the closet. Burt Dunk, the camera operator, plays Billy for most of, if not all of the point of view shots, and he is indeed the one who attacks and chokes Claire. Despite being a film about a killer stalking young women, the film has little to no blood and gore, something that films only a decade later would rely heavily upon to draw in its younger audience. Bob Clark never saw the film as a slasher and more of a psychological thriller. He preferred suspense over gratuity. While the girls enjoy watching Mrs. Mack open her present, Billy slowly carries Claire's body off into the attic, with nothing more than his shadow dancing along the walls while the girls downstairs cheer and laugh. Jess tries checking on Claire one last time before heading to bed, unaware that her friend is dead and in the attic. The following morning, Claire's father arrives at the university to pick her up, but she's nowhere to be found. So he goes to the sorority where even Mrs. Mack, who is supposed to be keeping an eye on the girls, hasn't seen her all night. Meanwhile, Jess meets with her boyfriend Peter to let him know that she's pregnant, and even though he's excited, she doesn't want it. She plans on having an abortion because she has plans for her future, and those plans would get disrupted by having a baby. This is setting up the boyfriend as the red herring for the film. He's already under a lot of stress practicing for a piano recital. He hasn't slept in days, and now he has a girlfriend who doesn't want his child. The day prior when he called her, he even told her that he loved her, and all she said was, "I know." The filmmakers want you to think that Peter could be the killer, and as the film goes on, he will only become more and more agitated and desperate for Jess to not go through with it. With no sign of Claire, her father, Barb, and Phil try to make a report on her disappearance. But Sergeant Nash isn't much help and simply thinks Claire most likely took off with her boyfriend. Despite Claire being seen as the more typical virginal girl that would often be the sole survivor in a film like this. Worried about her friend, Jess visits with Claire's boyfriend, Chris, telling him that Claire hasn't been seen all day and the police wouldn't take the case seriously because they think she's gone away with him. That night, Peter performs for his recital, but fails miserably. Clearly, everything that is going on is bringing him close to his breaking point and really only drives home the idea that he could be the killer. Back at the police station, a scared mother worries as her 13-year-old daughter has gone missing. One thing to note, however, despite being shot in Canada, the filmmakers did whatever they could to hide the fact that it was. There was a feeling amongst them that if people knew it was filmed in Canada, it could hurt distribution. So throughout the film, you'll see many American flags as a way to sort of trick the viewer into thinking they were watching an American film. But then throwing in a scene where there are guys playing hockey and later some snowmobiles in the park, which I think kind of shatters the illusion that this is anywhere but Canada. Everything gets interrupted when Chris comes barging with Jess, wanting to know why the hell they aren't taking Claire's case seriously. Luckily, Lieutenant Fuller intervenes and actually brings them in to talk. At the sorority, Barb, who is completely drunk, makes a fool of herself and says to Claire's father that his daughter is most likely dead. Phil knows she needs to cool off for the night and tells her to head to bed. Barb throughout the film is constantly drinking. She appears to have a bad relationship with her parents, and the drinking, along with the abrasive attitude, could be a coping mechanism for what she's dealing with mentally. Barb isn't the only one who has gone off the deep end, as Peter has completely destroyed his piano after failing his performance. Jess and Chris return to tell everyone that there will be a search party set up at the nearby park, looking for the young girl and Claire. So everyone gets their things to go to the park except for Mrs. Mack, who says she'll be leaving to see her sister for the holidays, so she might not be here when they get back. Bob Clark liked to have everyone working on the film involved beyond what their given role entailed. Co-producer Jerry Arbade has a cameo as the taxi driver, one of the police in the park was a production manager, and John Frenchie Berger, the prop master, was the man on the skidoo in the park. He even had some of the women working on the movie fill in as extra sorority girls. Debbie Weldon, the costume designer, was in the scene when Mrs. Mack opens her gift from the girls, with the joke being how ugly the nightgown is. Meanwhile, Debbie is standing there with the other girls, going on about how beautiful it is. A big reason for including so many people in the film was to keep things fun and light, but also because it helps save on money, which Bob was very diligent about. While the search party starts to spread out and look for the young girls, a shadowy figure stands outside the sorority house. We then see Claire's dead body as her cat jumps up and starts to lick her. During the filming of this scene, the cat in the film jumped up on her and began to lick her face. This wasn't intentional, but Bob took advantage of the situation because it brought a creepy mood to the scene, almost like the cat was trying to bring its dead owner back to life. However, this telling of the events seems to be contested as the actress that played Claire, Lynn Griffin, claims Bob threw the cat at her and they had laced the plastic that was covering her face with catnip. While Mrs. Mack's taxi waits outside for her, she can hear the cat meowing, so she goes off to investigate. This leads her to the attic. However, when she goes up, she discovers something very grim. Mrs. Mack is then attacked by Billy and pulled into the attic with a large meat hook. The decision to kill Mrs. Mack with a meat hook wasn't one taken lightly. They had to make sure they used a proper body harness to ensure Marion wouldn't get hurt when they performed the stunt. What they got instead was a man that showed up for 15 minutes, handed some straps to costume designer Debbie Weldon, then hightailed it. She had no idea what she was doing with the straps and asked the second unit director John Eckert if he could help her out. So he quickly removed his pants and they managed to figure out how the harness worked. At the park, Jess decides she's going back to the sorority as it's getting a little too cold for her. Immediately following her departure, they find the body of the missing 13-year-old girl. An interesting transition is when the mother is about to scream, you instead hear the ringing of the phone at the sorority, which turns out to be Billy. Jess shouts for Mrs. Mack, unaware that she is dead and in the attic along with Claire. Throughout the film, Bob Clark liked to keep the camera moving, almost as if it was circling around the characters. He did this to keep the audience guessing. Were they seeing through the eyes of the killer, or was it just the camera? Because of the constant movement, this led to issues with trying to hide the dolly track while filming inside the confines of the home. Often camera operator Burt Dunk would find himself walking backwards into walls or hitting the camera off doorways. Jess gets the fright of her life when Peter comes downstairs telling her he was sleeping and wants to talk everything over. He wants to quit the conservatory and get married to Jess so they can start a family. However, Jess still wants to do her own thing and turns him down. At the police station, Lieutenant Fuller questions Nash why he didn't think Claire's disappearance was important enough to look into. They found a missing 13-year-old girl dead in the park, Claire went missing, and the girls at Claire's sorority are all getting obscene phone calls. Peter starts to threaten Jess that if she goes through with the abortion of the baby, then she'll be very sorry. Lieutenant Fuller and Phil arrive at the sorority just as Peter leaves in a huff, which definitely sets off red flags for the lieutenant. The lieutenant has arrived with someone from the phone company so they can install a wiretap on the girl's phone and trace where the disturbing calls are coming from. The lieutenant has also left one of his men outside in a car, so if they feel threatened in any way, they can run to him. As the lieutenant leaves, Peter is still lingering around and watching the sorority house. Phil, exhausted from a long day of searching in the park and trying to find her friend, heads to bed as everything has been far too overwhelming for her. Jess is alerted to Barb having an asthma attack, however only moments before, Billy had entered her room and was hovering over her. Barb goes back to sleep as Jess goes back downstairs to listen to the Christmas carolers that just came to their door. However, when she does, Billy goes back inside Barb's room. The most graphic and violent death of the film takes place when Margot Kidder's character Barb is killed with a glass unicorn. But to make it creepier, the scene is juxtaposed against the backdrop of young children singing Christmas carols, which only heightens the disturbing nature of what's happening. But even still, the scene is almost completely devoid of blood, with only brief glimpses as the bloodied unicorn passes through crystal animals Barb has on the nightstand. Jess gets another call from Billy, and something very strange happens when Billy repeats something that Peter had said earlier in the film about Jess having the putting more fuel on the fire that Peter may be the killer.
You're talking about killing a baby as though you were having a wart removed.
Just like having a wart removed.
She isn't the only one to hear the call this time though, because Lieutenant Fuller was also on the line thanks to the tap. However, Billy wasn't on the line long enough for them to complete the trace. Phil tries to calm her fears by telling her the cop is still out front and there's no way Peter could be involved with this. Peter then calls Jess and he's a crying mess, telling her they can't kill the baby. Again though, the phone call isn't long enough to make a trace. Lieutenant Fuller calls her and asks what the phone call was all about, what he meant by "we can't kill the baby," which is when she tells the lieutenant and Phil that she is pregnant and wants an abortion. But it dawns on her that Peter was at the house when she received one of the calls earlier, so it couldn't be him, could it? The girls, realizing that the windows aren't locked, go around the house and lock them, but when Phil checks in on Barb, the door quickly closes behind her. Jess starts calling for Phil but gets no answer, and that's when another call is made. It's Billy once again calling from the den mother's phone, which was established earlier as being a separate phone line in the house. A trace is finally made, and Lieutenant Fuller is told that the calls are coming from the same address they're going to. The calls are coming from within the house. The cop that was left to watch the girls at this point is also now shown to be dead. Lieutenant Fuller gives Nash the responsibility of telling Jess to leave the house, but not why, otherwise she may freak out. All he tells her to do is to leave the house, but she keeps questioning why. Nash then lets it slip that the calls are coming from within the house and that she has to leave, even though her friends are upstairs. A review in Cinema Canada claimed the film was very misogynistic, which has always been a misconception with the horror genre. In Black Christmas, you have fantastically written female characters that all feel like very real college girls. Bob Clark never wrote the women to be weak or unintelligent. A big criticism is why Jess doesn't just run out the front door instead of staying inside with the killer. It was to show how brave she was, standing up to something so terrible. The fact she would grab a fire poker to protect her friends should be applauded, not looked down upon. Despite Jess knowing the killer is in the house, she still goes upstairs to find her friends. She finds them both dead in Barb's room, but that's not all. The peering eye of Billy as he says to her, "Agnes, it's me, Billy." Jess goes racing downstairs with Billy shrieking like a banshee. This, accompanied by Jess's blood-curdling scream when he grabs her hair, is pretty horrific. Jess locks herself in the basement, and Billy is heard leaving through the front door. While police rush to the scene, a dark figure can be seen outside the basement windows. Jess hides with her fire poker when Peter starts calling her name and smashes in one of the windows. She's completely terrified because she doesn't know if she can trust this man. He could have possibly just killed her friends. When the police arrive, they hear Jess's screams coming from the basement and break their way inside. What they find is the body of Peter, who Jess killed with the fire poker, and a clearly traumatized young girl. Jess is placed in her bed to rest, while Lieutenant Fuller and the others rejoice that the nightmare is finally over. However, the ending of the movie is one of the most terrifying things ever put to film. While everyone celebrates that the killer has been taken care of, the camera slowly pans across all the rooms where the girls were killed. It then goes into the attic where Billy looks over the women he's murdered. The camera begins to slowly pan away from the house, and then the phone starts to ring as the credits go across the screen, and the phone only gets louder and louder as the credits continue. They weren't setting up the idea that there will be another movie, just merely the fact that the killer is still inside the house, and now Jess is all alone. Much like the ending of Halloween when Michael Myers just vanishes after being shot, it leaves the viewer with the chilling thought that the killer is still out there and that no one is safe, including themselves. While no clear-cut explanation for Billy's motive or drive to kill is given, Bob Clark did lay out hints for the viewer to figure out. Billy was abused and abused his sister Agnes, and most likely killed his parents after snapping. It's all alluded to in the disturbing phone calls he makes to the sorority house, but still, nothing about him is concrete. His name more than likely probably isn't even Billy. The final shot of the film took 8 hours to light and was a fairly difficult task given the equipment available at the time. Camera operator Burt Dunk doesn't think the shot would look any different if filmed today, but could be much easier to do given the better technology. When Black Christmas released in Canada in the winter of 1974, it would go on to have the second best box office of any Canadian film during that time, pulling in $1.3 million during its full theatrical run. And even though it had a wide release within the United States, it failed to live up to the box office it achieved in Canada. The film was picked up by Warner Brothers in the United States, and Bob Clark and producer Jerry Arbade were invited to come to a screening of the film. Everyone who attended the screening had to fill out cards about what they thought of the film, and the feedback was glowing. The one thing they didn't like, however, was the title. Warner Brothers executives thought the title Black Christmas was misleading and would make people think they were seeing a film about black people during Christmas. During this time, the blaxploitation genre was in full swing with films like Shaft, Coffee, and Blackula, and they didn't want people to confuse it with one of those. To quell this confusion, they instead changed the name to Silent Night, Evil Night. The executives also wanted the ending to change, either having no phone call at the end or making it so Peter was in fact the killer, which wouldn't make any sense. Luckily, no changes to the film were actually made. Warner Brothers executives were hoping since the film made $1.3 million in Canada, then they should be able to do $7 million in the US. Unfortunately, this would prove to be very wrong, when the film would only go on to make $284,000 during its entire theatrical run, as it had to go up against films like The Godfather Part 2 and The Man with the Golden Gun. The film was re-released in 1975 in LA, and in 1 week it made $86,000. Warner Brothers decided to test their luck and expand the showings outside of LA, but would end the theatrical run of the film with just under $1 million in total earnings that year. American critics lambasted the film, they just didn't get it. The idea of taking Christmas and horror and mashing the two together only seemed to confuse them. It wasn't something that had really been done up to that point, or at least done on the same creative level, so they really didn't know what to make of it. Many of these critics have gone back and changed their opinion of the film over the years, and the movie has become something of a cult classic. In 1978, the film was set to make its network debut on NBC. The film was renamed to Stranger in the House, but just 2 weeks prior to its premiere, 2 young college students were attacked and bludgeoned to death at the Chi Omega sorority house on the Florida State University in Tallahassee. 2 other victims were attacked as well, but they managed to survive. The perpetrator of the attacks turned out to be serial killer Ted Bundy. Because of these vicious attacks, the film was removed from its time slot and replaced with Doc Savage, The Man of Bronze. The film would eventually go on to air at a later date. Black Christmas could be argued as being part of a series of films along with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween to usher in the slasher craze of the 1980s. Bob Clark and John Carpenter had been working on a film together, a film that never came to be, and according to Bob Clark, John Carpenter asked him if he had any plans on making a sequel, to which Bob said no. Apparently, John asked him what he would do if he did make a sequel, and Bob said, "I said it would be the next year, and the guy would have actually been caught, escape from a mental institution, and go back to the house, and they would start all over again, and I would call it Halloween." Even though he would have called his sequel Halloween, Bob Clark insisted that in no way did John Carpenter copy his idea. He may have been influenced a bit, but the story and everything else was his own. Plus, according to Bob, there were close to 15 other scripts titled Halloween at the time, but it was John that actually used the title. Black Christmas survives because of its fans. If it had not been for the fans keeping the memory of the film alive throughout the 80s and 90s, then it may not have gotten its DVD release in the early 2000s. Since the release of the DVD and the Blu-rays, the fan base and appreciation for this little Canadian horror film has grown over the years. Renewed interest in the film would lead to a remake in 2006, which followed the story of the original fairly closely. However, in place of the suspense that Bob Clark masterfully created, the film was filled with more over-the-top gore and violence, losing the essence of what made the original so impactful. Another remake was released by Blumhouse in 2019 and was Black Christmas in name only. It was an incredibly awful film and panned by both fans and critics alike. Black Christmas is one of my all-time favorite horror films, and I watch it every year around this time. I love the chilling atmosphere, and that ending is one of the creepiest things that I've ever seen. Next year is the 50th anniversary of Black Christmas. I don't think Bob Clark or any of the actors in the movie knew what effect their little film would have on the horror genre, but despite how much time passes, the film's fan base only seems to grow, and the legacy of Black Christmas is something that will only continue for generations to come.